Mark, and today we begin a brand new series called Making Life Work. And we're going to go through the book of Proverbs, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. The final thing you need to know is today's message itself is different, because a lot of what I'm going to share will be introductory material, but it's very important because, believe it or not, people do some hinky things with the Proverbs, and I want to try to save you and save myself from doing that, so we need to put this bookend in place before we get into it to understand it. Second thing is, this talk's probably going to be a little bit shorter. We're just going to look at a few of the verses, and then we'll jump into the rest of the book thematically and looking at its mega themes in the coming weeks. But we will begin today by looking at something called the prologue. It's the first 7 verses of the book that really kind of introduce what the book is about. So with that stuff said, let's go ahead and pick up here in your notes. And I want to begin today with a definition of what a proverb is. Because if we're not all on the same page here, we might as well be telling a junior high girl not to like Hannah Montana. I mean, we're really not going anywhere. So we need to make sure that we're connected on understanding what a proverb is and does, both in English and in Hebrew, and what we'll see in the Scripture. So let's start with this little simple definition of a proverb being a short, pithy statement that gives us insight into how life works. And in our English language, we hear these proverbs all the time. We hear things like an apple a day keeps the doctor away, absence makes the heart grow fonder, all that glitters is not gold. And in English, they're kind of a verbal shorthand that's meant to be understood quickly, and they're different in Hebrew. Because when you look, even in the languages in which, or the language in which this was actually written, there are actually little devices that have been inserted to slow the reader down so that they might think very carefully and slowly understand what is being said here. You also notice, if you're a literature kind of person, that you'll see things such as similes and metaphors and parallelism. And the thought here is to make people take a long, hard look at the truth that's before them. If you want a mental picture, it's a good picture of this. It's a picture of candy. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Gatlinburg, but there's a corner down there. I think it's called Aunt Mahalia's or something like that, or maybe up the street you'll see another place. And there's this big, huge machine that's just churning out this taffy. And it's amazing because it always draws a crowd, and you'll see like big people and small people and even diabetics, and they're all gathered around looking at this candy, and they're like, I want to experience this candy to the full effect. Well, that's kind of what you see here in Proverbs, that they're meant to be understood slowly. They're a little bit paradoxical. It may take some time, but it's meant to be like a piece of candy that kind of melts in your mouth so that you get the fullest effect. Now, a couple of foundational things I'll mention to you now, and we'll pull out a little bit more when we look at the verses. But Proverbs is basically ascribed to Solomon. He didn't write them all, but he wrote a good portion of them. There's a little bit of debate on exactly what he did and didn't write. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because he was the compiler of the book and drew it together. And there's a few purposes that I think we've got to understand here at the outset. First, that they are given to impart wisdom, to help leaders and rulers in their day, but they still have some great application in our day as well. And also to help form our character. Ultimately, if you want to understand what the purpose of the Proverbs would be, it's what the title of the series is. It's to make life work. This guy named Eugene Peterson, smart guy, helped translate a book called The Message. He actually had this to say about Proverbs and things like it. Many people think that what's written in the Bible has mostly to do with getting people into heaven. It does have to do with that, of course, but not mostly. It's equally concerned with living on this earth, living well. Catch this. Living in robust sanity on earth as it is in heaven is Jesus' prayer. So if you want another picture to kind of look at the whole book of Proverbs, what is it in a single picture? Well, I think it's this picture. It's that of a compass. A compass. That Proverbs provide for us a compass to help navigate the many questions of life. You know, and these questions of life are where a lot of us live. Should I date this person? Should I marry this person? Should I take this job? Should I move here? Maybe you're wrestling this morning on whether or not you should buy the new Jonas Brothers CD. Well, I'll answer that one for you. Of course not. But we have all these different questions that make up life. And Proverbs helps us navigate those kind of like a compass. Because see, even though the Scriptures are completely inerrant and they speak God's Word to us and they reveal Christ to us in all of His beauty, they don't give specific answers about a lot of the specific questions of life. Because they can't answer for everyone whether or not you should take that job or you should move to this apartment or this home or whatever. And so we need a compass to help navigate those. And that compass works, I think, in three ways. First, it helps instruct us in making right decisions, both explicitly and implicitly. Second, it helps us grow in wisdom that we will need to make right decisions. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, they help us become the right kind of people who make the right kind of decisions. Now, I want to say to you just a little bit about the method that we'll use to get through the book of Proverbs. We just did Mark, and we went through it paragraph by paragraph because it's something called narrative. It's an unfolding story. But see, Proverbs is not that at all. It is a collection of these things that are put together, in many cases, in no certain order. So it would be foolish for us to work through it paragraph by paragraph. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what some would call mega themes. That there are big themes. We'll see a couple emerge today of the wise man and the fool, the fear of the Lord, the heart. All these themes that kind of run throughout the book that hold it together. But also certain topics that come out. Things like sex and money and alcohol and parenting and work. And so the approach we'll take in the coming weeks is looking at both the themes and then also looking at the topics. And in order to do that effectively, I think we'll need to see a little bit of interpretation help here as well. Because it's important for us to understand at the outset that Proverbs are principles. They're not promises. And there are people who come to the Proverbs and say, but I did this, I did exactly what the Proverbs said to do, and then their life doesn't work out, and then they're disillusioned with the Scriptures and disappointed with God and upset with themselves. Well, part of that comes from trying to handle the literature, which this is called wisdom literature, and it needs to be interpreted as such, in a way that it was never intended to be. A good example would be if you sat down with a science textbook, and you went and you said, sweetheart, I just really want to share this with you. I think it's going to be life-changing. And you opened it up and you talked about botany or about other different things, and she wasn't compelled by your affection toward her. Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Because you're trying to use a type of literature in a way that it was never intended to be. And see, people try to do that sometimes with the Proverbs. So we need to understand, first and foremost, that they're general principles and not promises. And that naturally leads to this, that there will sometimes be exceptions. A guy named John Ortberg, done a lot of thinking about this, says this in regard to the Proverbs, that in the Scriptures, there is law, there are promises, and there are proverbs. Law would be things like Deuteronomy chapter 6, like Mr. Matt taught our kids this morning. That we see things like love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That's without exception. It's for all people, all times, all places. But then you also see a promise. This is a guarantee from God that will always be true. Things like Romans 8, that nothing will separate us from the love of God. Things like what Jesus says at the Great Commission's end, when He says He'll be with us always, even to the end of the age. It's a promise that we can count on being true. And then you'll see what we have here in this book. Proverbs, general statements about how the way the world is intended to go. A guy named Tremper Longman says this, Proverbs don't teach a universally valid truth. Many proverbs are only true if stated at the right time and in the right circumstance. They're not guaranteed promises for success. They are wise observations about how to live in God's world. So if we want to understand how to rightly interpret Proverbs, situation is key. Situation. You may want to circle that in your notes. Good example. Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5. Two verses that seem to be completely opposed to one another. Let's figure this out. Proverbs 26, verse 4 says, Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Next verse. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Now you're looking at this and you're going, okay, I don't really understand what to do here. Do I answer the fool? Do I not answer the fool? Well, the situation is the key, because if he's standing there holding a beer can and a gun, you probably shouldn't answer the fool. But if it's your 3 or 4-year-old child and they do something foolish, well, then you need to answer the fool, because they haven't even been alive long enough to know that they shouldn't put a bean up their nose, which has happened at my house many times. And to do other things. And you need to speak into that situation and meet that fool where they are. So the situation is key to understanding how to interpret them. Next thing, and I think this is very important, and it might be somewhat of a new idea for some of us. I believe if we want to get the Proverbs right, we must connect them to both Jesus and the gospel, or we miss their fullest intention, and we can fall into something called moralism. Now, a lot of times, the way that folks like me stand up and talk about Proverbs is they basically say, here's what the Bible says, now you go do it. And that's true, and I'll do that. But I believe if you don't connect it to Jesus and the gospel, well, you can get in all kinds of trouble. Because let's say you do go do it, and you begin to feel real good about yourself. And you begin to feel a little bit self-righteous. And you start to look down your spiritual nose at all those people who don't do the Proverbs like you. Well, you're on the track to moralism. Let's say that spiritual energy runs out, you move along, you begin to not obey them as once you did, and you begin to say, you know what, I guess I'm really just not much of a Christian. What am I going to do? And then you begin to kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and realize that after a while, you're really not that good of a Christian. And then you have a choice to make. Are you going to despair and become depressed? Or are you going to say, you know what, I can't fulfill these completely, but there is someone who did fulfill them completely. It's who's pointed to in Proverbs 8. It's who's pointed to as the wisdom of God, and that person's name is Jesus. Because see, when we come to Proverbs, we don't just need principles, we need a person. And Jesus didn't die just to make us wise people, but He died to conform us to His image. So if we want to handle Proverbs rightly, we need to understand that they have a meaning in their historical, grammatical context, but it also points us to the big story of the Bible of what God has done through Jesus. And a way that we can apply the gospel when we deal with Proverbs is to say, hey, Jesus, I need the strength to fulfill what you've told me to fulfill. I need your example of wisdom. I need your strength to walk in that example. And I need your grace when I don't fulfill what you've called me to fulfill. So if we want to understand this rightly, we want to understand it in light of Jesus and the gospel. Let me give you one other picture. It's this. It's that of an unfolding flower. That we here at Crossing talk is significant about something called redemptive history. That God has done something throughout history to bring men and women and boys and girls back to Himself. That in the beginning of time, He created Adam and Eve, and there was a little exchange with a piece of fruit. They kind of broke the world, and it's kind of been downhill ever since. But here's the good news. God, in His infinite love and mercy and wisdom, sent Jesus to restore humanity back to Himself and eventually even set all of creation right. And so it's this unfolding flower, this story that's being told throughout time. And when we understand that Proverbs are a part of that story, and they point us to Christ and they help us apply the gospel, then we will be able to truly taste the goodness of this candy. Then we'll be able to truly use this compass. Then we will be able to truly smell this unfolding flower that God has given us in the Scriptures. So a good question I think we ought to ask ourselves up to this point is that how we currently read the Bible? If it is, I think we're on a pretty good track. But if not, let me challenge you that as we look through these, especially in regard to character formation, that we're always reading them looking for the fingerprints upon the text. Now, speaking of the text, let's take a look at verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And what you have here is more of a title to the book rather than a statement of authorship. And as I mentioned to you at the outset, Proverbs is largely written by Solomon. We don't know exactly how much it seems, but he is kind of credited with all of it. He was a very important king in the life of Israel. He is the son of David, who was the greatest king in Israel. And we also have these great anecdotal stories of him, both from the Scriptures and all from what people have said about him, that he was the wisest man in the world. One story is there's a woman named the Queen of Sheba came and spoke to him and said, I want to learn from you because you are so wise. Another story we see in the book of 1 Kings is Solomon could have asked for anything in the world, any kind of wealth, any kind of toy, and instead he asked God for wisdom. So this is a man who at this point in his life lived in a very exemplary way and gave us unbelievable wisdom that is inspired by God for us to learn. So that's probably the most substantial difference between a proverb that we would have and a proverb that we have in the Scriptures is because they're part of the Scripture that God has given us, they're useful, as 2 Timothy 3:16 would say, for teaching, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness. And so when Solomon is speaking here, he's speaking with the authority of God to help shape us. And we see beginning here in verse 2 with these sentence fragments, that intention set forth. To know wisdom and instruction. To understand words of insight. This word wisdom here is the word hokmah. And it can mean a lot of different things in the Scriptures, but here it seems to speak of living skillfully. It's almost a picture of a craftsman that's putting together a piece of art in a way that is beautiful and skillful. And so the concept here is that the Proverbs are given to help us live skillfully, to make life work. Now the second phrase here, to understand words of insight, speaks of developing what we saw before as a compass of discernment, that we'd be able to navigate those questions in an effective way. Verse 3, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity. And I think there's two things at work in this verse. First, that when we use this compass of discernment, that there will be natural outflowings that manifest themselves in our lives. Things like righteousness, being able to conform to God's perfect standard, which we know we can only do through Christ because He's done it. But to walk in that direction comes from this kind of moral compass. Then justice and equity. It means to treat people right, to not rip people off, to leave a good tip if you're a Christian. All the waiters just smiled at me. And so the concept here is to treat people in the right way that naturally flows from having this kind of discernment. Verse 4, we see who the book of Proverbs is for. To give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. The simple. If you're from the South, these are these people that when you say their name, it's quickly followed by the phrase, bless their hearts. Because these are folks who are a bit naive. These are folks who can get taken in. These are folks who buy way too much on QVC that they should have never bought in the first place. And so what we have here is somewhat of a compass specifically for folks who would be a little bit naive. But see, that's not the only group of people that it's for. We see here also that there is knowledge and discretion to the youth. That's why a lot of parents, including myself, try to teach Proverbs to their children so that they understand something about how the world works and how they can make their life work in it to bring God the most glory and themselves and those around them most good. So there's special attention here given to the youth. Many people see the tone throughout Proverbs as that it's fatherly advice. That Solomon is speaking to his son, you see it repeatedly, and he uses that metaphor to communicate all this truth. And I also think there's a special word there for a church like ours. It's mostly young people. Even our oldest folks, they're young. And so what we have is a unique opportunity to sit under this as a community and to learn, to pick up wisdom. Look here, verse 5. Because it's not just for young people, it's not just for simple people, it's for wise people. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. So in essence, it's for everyone. That there is a message and a word of truth for everyone in Proverbs. So if you feel like you got nothing to learn, you feel like you got life all figured out, well, maybe this is not the series for you. But if you're like the rest of us and realize that there's a lot to learn about parenting and work and sex and money and children and how to make this life go, well, then you're in a good place. And it's a good place to begin with the beginning. Look at verse 7. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And here, and I just want to speak to it briefly because we'll unpack it all next week, is two concepts that are introduced. Number one, the fear of the Lord. It's two things here. You see that there is a shrinking back in fear because of the greatness and the awesomeness of God, but there's also a drawing close to God through holy awe. We see these two polar concepts brought together in the concept of the fear of the Lord, which many believe is the ultimate theme throughout the book. And then you also see here someone called the fool, who despises wisdom and instruction. And what you'll see time and time again in this book is a picture painted of the wise man who listens to instruction and the fool who turns away from this kind of instruction. And the idea that he lays out here in the prologue is, hey, if you want to be wise, listen to me. But if you want to be a fool, then you just blow off what I'm saying. And I think that's what's before us today. That as we begin this journey, just laying out these foundational truths, we stand at a crossroads. Are we going to listen and walk in wisdom, or are we going to not listen and walk in folly? Because the picture is going to be very clear of those who are wise and those who are foolish. Now, what do we do with what we've heard today? Well, I think it's two things, and it comes to us on a personal level, and it comes to us on a community level as well. First thing, I think we ought to take a little personal inventory and ask a couple of questions. Number one, where do I need to grow most in wisdom? What is it that if you looked at my life and you look at the decisions that I make, where does it look like I'm kind of not knowing where I'm going? Where do I need to get my bearings and use this compass God has given me? Is it in regard to biblical manhood and womanhood? Proverbs are going to speak about that. Is it in regard to being a better parent? Proverbs are going to speak about that. Money, work. Where do you need wisdom the most? Second thing, where do you need your character formed the most? Is it with what you say and not say? Is it knowing when to speak and what to say, or when to just keep your mouth shut? Is it your temper? Is it in how you treat other people? Proverbs has got a word for all that. And as you come to that conclusion even this morning, I encourage you to share that with your community group this week. You know, one of the things that's really close to the heartbeat of who we are as a church is the concept of community. We think that people in North America a lot of times just get it wrong. They just kind of say everything is individual, and I'm going to compartmentalize my life, and then I'm going to sit in the corner with just me and my Bible, and just Jesus and I are going to work it out. But if you read the New Testament, those books, in large part, are written to communities. And there's a sense in which our faith, our salvation, it is individual, but then it is to be lived out within a community. Proverbs were written so that they might be read in community. And so you need people watching your back and helping you along as you think about those areas. Where does my character need to be formed? And where do I need wisdom? Share that with other people, because they're going to have answers as well. Now, I also think there's communal application here as well. One of the things I was thinking about this week as I was praying and preparing for this is the concept of a counterculture. That if we will listen and do what this book tells us, that we will be able to create, by God's grace, a city within the city. And I had this picture in my mind that I just want to cast for you this morning, and oh, that God would do this within our church. That we become so wise that the people we work with, the people we live next to, that they would come to us and ask us about Jesus, because we live and act so different from the madness in the world around us. Can you picture that with me? That there would be folks who would approach you who would say, you know what, you just seem like you understand how to raise your kids. You seem like you understand how to work your job and work hard, but not too hard. You seem like you know when to speak and when to stay quiet. See, if we hear and do what we need to do by light and God's grace, we will see a counterculture created. We will see a group of people that learn how to serve the poor, that learn how to serve one another, that learn how to speak words of life and not death. And I think that has a missional, attractive element. So I think the question we need to ask this morning is, are we getting our bearings? We're being handed a compass, both with individual and communal implications, and are we ready to get our bearings? You know, here at Crossing, as I laid out for you, these proverbs have a meaning, but they find their ultimate meaning in what these symbols represent. Because the big story of the Bible is not just, here's how to live wisely, it's how to engage with the God who is most wise and most holy, who gave us the wisdom of God in Jesus. And so everything starts with and flows from the gospel for us. So this morning, for some of us who are here, the wisest move that we can make is turn away from trying to make ourselves right with God and dealing with our sin through our own religious accoutrements and trying to shore ourselves up before God. And to say that way doesn't work, and I want to walk after God's wisdom, which begins with Christ. And today, when everyone takes communion, don't take it. Instead, come and bring the person who brought you. There'll be both men and women in the back that would love to pray with you and answer any questions you might have. And say, I want to begin to walk the path of wisdom with Christ, and I understand that I've got to turn from my sin and trust in Him to see that happen. For the rest of us, Perhaps today, even as we've talked, you've been able to say, hey, here's where I didn't have wisdom. Here's where I didn't have wisdom even on the way to church this morning. I need to repent, I need to turn from those sins, and I need to be reminded that Jesus Christ died for that, and now He lives so that I might live in a way that makes life worth. Prepare our hearts for the sacred meal. Stand with me if you could. I'm going to read this text together.